If you look at the environment today, we're in a supply shortage in certain markets. And at some point, we're going to catch up in terms of supply and demand and get back to equilibrium or even into an oversupply situation. So that's something that I've been watching now for over 20 years. So it's possible. I do think that the cadences, because there are more and more different markets using semiconductors versus, say, 15, 20 years ago when it was driven primarily by the PC industry. So whenever the PCs went up, everything else went up. When it went down, everything else went down. Now we've got different markets, whether it's, the medical, automotive, data center, PCs are still there, and smartphones. I'm just naming a few of the markets. Because of that, you have different cadences. And some of the traditional cycle trends that we've seen, I think, get a little more muted because of these different markets.
Patrick, over recent decades, we've increasingly focused on the shift of the semiconductor industry to Asia, ultimately, and the manufacturing hubs of Samsung, South Korea more generally, and, of course, TSMC in Taiwan. Steve referenced the new American Semiconductor Act in his first question here. To what extent do you think that changes now the way investors need to think about how to make money out of semiconductor companies? Is there going to be a refocusing back to North America?
I think over time there will be. I don't think anything's going to change dramatically in the next 3 to 5 years, just because it takes time for these new fabs to get built, then installed with equipment, and then up and running. But I think the important thing for at least the United States is we've lost a lot, to be honest with you, in terms of our ability, both on a process technology front as well as manufacturing capacity. Heck, Intel, the leader of semiconductors, not only in the US, but in the world for so long, has shifted a lot of their manufacturing overseas. It's good to hear now that Pat Gelsinger is going to start building out new fabs in the US, because this is where they started. But because of the overseas shifts, the lower labor costs, the benefits from taxes, all of that have attracted not only Intel, but a lot of other companies to go overseas. So I think the US CHIPS Act is a good first measure to kind of get the footing for the US to eventually and hopefully reestablish its leadership in the semiconductor world.
Patrick, I don't want to scare anyone about this, but this is about rebuilding a military-industrial complex in the West as well, for the fear of worse things to come.
Yeah, I don't want to deny that there's some national security issues, because, look, one of the areas where semiconductor content is also increasing is in the military. So it's something where I do think that there's a national security aspect of it. And given the reliance that we have today, particularly with TSMC, for a lot of our US companies like an AMD, like an NVIDIA, like a Qualcomm, that reliance on Taiwan does put us at some geopolitical risk right now. It would be better to have manufacturing in the US for just those reasons. In my opinion, I don't think, again, anything's going to change in the near term, but that's a risk that we can kind of mitigate over time.
And Patrick, how do we need to think about the valuations of these companies? Because if you look at the performance of most semiconductor stocks over the last year, it's not been great. I think the Philly Semi Index is down over 20% YTD. And so as you look at the way the market itself is analyzing prospects for these businesses, it's suggesting that they've had the best of it for this cycle. What do you think?
In my opinion, for the stocks, I think it may be a little bit overdone at this point. Some of the weakness that people have talked about have transpired. So whether it's in PCs, low-end smartphones, consumer electronics, I think that's built in. But again, I'll go back to something I said. There are a lot of different markets, and that's driving semiconductor content, whether it's data centers, artificial intelligence, industrial, automotive. A lot of these marketplaces are still driving silicon. And in turn, I especially like the equipment companies, because they're kind of the arms supplier to the chip makers. And I believe that this time around, they'll have more resiliency and a lot more fortitude in their operating models versus in the past when, you're right, cyclical trends used to dictate this, but I think it's a lot less today.